The room was filled with laughter, the kind that comes from years of shared memories and unshakable bonds. Plates of food were passed around, stories were exchanged, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The family had gathered to celebrate their parents' anniversary, a rare occasion where everyone was present. The protagonist sat at the table, glancing at his older brother, the man he had always admired. His brother was the kind of person who seemed to have it all, a successful career, a beautiful wife, 2 bright kids, and the respect of everyone who knew him. But in a single moment, that image shattered. It started with a phone. A soft buzz, barely noticeable, but enough to make the brother's wife pause mid-sentence. She reached for the device on the table, her face turning pale as she read the message on the screen. The room fell silent as she stood up, her hands trembling. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The brother froze, his fork hovering over his plate. He tried to brush it off, but the damage was done. The wife's voice grew louder, her words sharp and accusing. "You've been lying to me. How long has this been going on?" The children, wide-eyed and confused, looked from their mother to their father, unsure of what was happening. The protagonist felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always known his brother to be a man of integrity, someone who would never hurt his family. But the look on his brother's face, a mix of guilt and panic, told a different story. The argument escalated quickly. The brother tried to explain, but his words only made things worse. "It was a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen." But the wife wasn't having it. Tears streamed down her face as she hurled accusations, each one cutting deeper than the last. The parents, seated at the head of the table, looked on in stunned silence, their anniversary celebration crumbling before their eyes. And then, in a moment of desperation, the brother stood up and walked out. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the house, leaving behind a heavy silence. The wife collapsed into a chair, sobbing, while the children clung to her, their small faces filled with fear and confusion. The protagonist sat frozen, his mind racing. How could this have happened? How could the man he had always looked up to, the man who had taught him the importance of honesty and loyalty, betray his own family? As the reality of the situation sank in, the protagonist felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. But more than anything, he felt a burning question: why? Why had his brother made such a choice? And how would their family ever recover from this? The scene ended with the protagonist staring at the closed door, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. The laughter and joy of the evening had been replaced by a suffocating tension, and the once strong bond between the brothers now felt fragile, like a thread on the verge of snapping. The protagonist couldn't sleep that night. The image of his brother walking out the door played on a loop in his mind, each repetition stirring up more questions than answers. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. To understand how things had gone so wrong, he needed to go back, to a time when everything seemed perfect. His brother had always been the golden child. Growing up, he was the one who excelled in school, the one who landed the scholarships, the one who seemed destined for greatness. While the protagonist had struggled to find his footing, his brother had always been there to guide him, offering advice and encouragement. "You'll get there," he would say with a reassuring smile. "Just keep pushing." As adults, their lives had taken different paths. The protagonist had settled into a modest job, content with the simple joys of life. His brother, on the other hand, had climbed the corporate ladder with ease, becoming a well-known figure in their small town. He had married his high school sweetheart, a kind and intelligent woman who complimented him in every way. Together, they had built a life that seemed straight out of a storybook, a beautiful home, 2 children who were the pride of their lives, and a future full of promise. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. The protagonist had noticed small changes in his brother over the past year. He seemed more distant, more preoccupied. There were times when he would cancel plans at the last minute, citing work commitments. His phone, which he had always left lying around, was now kept close, its screen always face down. The protagonist had brushed it off, assuming it was just the stress of his brother's demanding job. Then there were the late nights. The brother, who had always been a family man, started coming home later and later. His wife had confided in the protagonist once, her voice tinged with worry. "He says it's work, but I don't know," she had said. "Something feels off." The protagonist had reassured her, telling her not to overthink it. "He's just under a lot of pressure," he had said. "He'll be fine." But now, as he lay in bed, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something. He thought back to a conversation he had had with his brother a few months ago. They had been sitting on the porch, sharing a beer, when the brother had suddenly grown quiet. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" he had asked, his voice heavy with something the protagonist couldn't quite place. At the time, the protagonist had laughed it off. "What are you talking about? You've got the perfect life, man." His brother had smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," he had said. "I guess I do." Now, those words took on a new meaning. Had his brother been trying to tell him something? Had he been unhappy all along? The protagonist's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of the past year. There had been signs, subtle but undeniable, that something was wrong. But he had chosen to ignore them, to believe in the image of his brother that he had always held on to. The next morning, the protagonist decided to visit his brother. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for the family that had been left in shambles. He drove to the small apartment his brother had rented, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and fear. When he knocked on the door, it took a few moments for his brother to answer. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept. "What are you doing here?" the brother asked, his voice flat. "We need to talk," the protagonist said, stepping inside. The apartment was sparse, with only a few pieces of furniture and boxes stacked in the corner. It was a stark contrast to the warm, inviting home his brother had shared with his family. The brother sat down on the couch, his head in his hands. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "I never wanted this to happen." The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Then why did it? Why did you throw everything away?" For a long moment, the brother didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I felt like I was drowning. Like no matter how much I had, it was never enough. And then I met someone, and for a little while, it felt like I could breathe again. But it was a mistake. I know that now." The protagonist felt a surge of anger, but it was tempered by something else, pity. His brother, the man who had always seemed so strong, so invincible, was broken. And as much as he wanted to hate him, he couldn't. "You need to fix this," the protagonist said firmly. "Not just for your wife and kids, but for yourself. You can't just walk away." The brother looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know if I can." "You have to try," the protagonist said. "Because if you don't, you're going to lose everything. And I don't know if you'll ever get it back." As he left the apartment, the protagonist felt a sense of determination. His brother's choices had changed everything, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to make things right. The days that followed the revelation were a blur of tension and heartache. The brother's wife, once the picture of strength and grace, now moved through the house like a shadow. Her eyes were red from crying, and her voice, usually so warm and inviting, was now hollow. The children, sensing their mother's pain, clung to her even more, their innocent questions adding to the weight of the situation. "Why isn't Dad coming home?" the youngest asked one evening, her small voice trembling. The wife hesitated, her face a mask of anguish, before forcing a smile. "Dad's just busy with work right now," she said, her voice breaking. The protagonist, who had been staying with them to help, felt a pang of guilt. He knew the truth, but he couldn't bring himself to explain it to the children. Not yet. The brother, meanwhile, was struggling in his own way. He had tried to reach out to his wife, calling and texting, but she refused to answer. The few times he showed up at the house, she wouldn't let him in. "You made your choice," she said through the closed door, her voice cold and unyielding. "Now live with it." The protagonist found himself caught in the middle. He wanted to support his sister-in-law and the children, but he also couldn't abandon his brother. He visited the apartment regularly, trying to convince his brother to take responsibility for his actions. "You can't just hide here," he said one afternoon. "You need to face what you've done." But the brother was paralyzed by guilt and shame. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice heavy with despair. "Every time I try to think of what to say, I can't." The strain began to take its toll on everyone. The wife, who had always been the glue that held the family together, was now barely holding herself together. She stopped going to work, leaving the protagonist to handle the bills and the children's school schedules. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on everyone inside. One evening, the protagonist found his sister-in-law sitting alone in the kitchen, a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I don't know what to do," she confessed. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, all the times I should have known something was wrong. How could I have been so blind?" The protagonist sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. "It's not your fault," he finally offered. "He made his choices. You didn't do anything wrong." But his words offered little comfort. "I just keep thinking about the kids," she said, her voice breaking. "How do I explain this to them? How do I tell them that their father, she couldn't finish the sentence, her tears spilling over. The protagonist felt a surge of anger toward his brother. How could he have been so selfish? How could he have risked everything for a moment of weakness? But beneath the anger was a deep sadness, for his brother, for his sister-in-law, and for the children who were caught in the middle of a mess they didn't understand. As the weeks passed, the tension in the house grew unbearable. The children, sensing the strain, began acting out. The youngest started having nightmares, while the oldest withdrew into herself, spending hours alone in her room. The wife, overwhelmed by it all, finally broke down one night, sobbing uncontrollably as the protagonist held her. "I can't do this," she cried. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." The protagonist knew something had to change. He couldn't let the family fall apart, not like this. The next day, he went to see his brother again. This time, he didn't mince words. "You need to step up," he said firmly. "Your wife is falling apart, your kids are confused and scared, and you're sitting here feeling sorry for yourself. That's not going to fix anything." The brother looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to fight for your family," the protagonist said. "I want you to show them that you're willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Because if you don't, you're going to lose them forever." For a long moment, the brother didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You're right," he said. "I've been a coward. But I can't keep running away. I need to face this, no matter how hard it is." The protagonist felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The brother's decision to face his mistakes didn't come with immediate solutions or grand gestures. It began quietly, with small, painful steps. The first was therapy. He started attending sessions twice a week, sitting in a dimly lit office with a counselor who pushed him to confront the choices he had made and the pain he had caused. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he wanted to walk out, to bury his guilt and shame and pretend none of it had happened. But he stayed, determined to understand why he had risked everything for a fleeting sense of escape. The protagonist, though still angry, supported his brother in this journey. He drove him to therapy sessions, sat with him afterward as they talked about what had been discussed, and listened as his brother slowly began to open up. "I didn't realize how lost I was," the brother admitted one evening. "I kept chasing this idea of success, of being the perfect husband and father, but it was never enough. I felt like I was failing everyone, including myself. Meanwhile, the brother's wife was struggling to find her own footing. She had started seeing a therapist as well, trying to process the betrayal and figure out what she wanted for her future. The protagonist often stayed with the children while she attended her sessions, doing his best to provide some sense of normalcy in their lives. He took them to the park, helped with homework, and tried to answer their questions as honestly as he could without overwhelming them. "Is Dad ever coming back?" the youngest asked one day, her big eyes filled with confusion. The protagonist hesitated, then knelt down to her level. "I don't know," he said gently. "But what I do know is that your dad loves you very much, and he's trying to figure things out. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and it takes time to fix them." The child nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but the protagonist couldn't shake the sadness he felt. He hated seeing the family he loved so much in such pain, and he hated that there were no easy answers. As the weeks turned into months, the brother began to make small efforts to reconnect with his family. He started by writing letters to his wife, pouring out his thoughts and apologies in pages filled with raw honesty. At first, she didn't respond. But one day, she called him. Her voice was hesitant, but there was a flicker of something, curiosity, maybe even hope. "I read your letters," she said. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I'm willing to listen." It wasn't much, but it was a start. They began meeting occasionally, sometimes with their therapist, sometimes alone. The conversations were difficult, filled with tears and anger, but they were talking. And slowly, very slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. The brother also made an effort to be present for his children. He started attending their school events, sitting in the back and keeping his distance at first, but gradually becoming more involved. The kids, though hesitant at first, began to warm up to him. They missed their dad, and despite everything, they wanted him in their lives. One evening, the brother showed up at the house with a box of board games. "I thought we could play something together," he said, his voice tentative. The children exchanged glances, then nodded. They spent the next few hours laughing and playing, and for a moment, it felt like old times. The wife watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable, but she didn't stop them. The protagonist, observing from the sidelines, felt a mix of emotions. He was proud of his brother for trying, but he also knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be earned overnight, and trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. As the months passed, the brother continued to work on himself. He joined a support group for people struggling with infidelity, finding solace in the shared experiences of others. He also made an effort to be more open with his family, sharing his thoughts and feelings instead of hiding behind a facade of perfection. The wife, too, began to heal. She started focusing on herself, rediscovering hobbies she had put aside and reconnecting with friends. She still had moments of anger and sadness, but they were becoming less frequent. One day, she called the protagonist. "I don't know what's going to happen," she admitted. "But I think I'm ready to try. For the kids, and for myself." The protagonist felt a surge of relief. It wasn't a guarantee that things would work out, but it was a step in the right direction. A year had passed since the night that changed everything. The family had weathered the storm, though the scars remained. The brother and his wife were still living separately, but they had found a way to coexist peacefully, putting their children's needs first. The brother had moved into a small house nearby, close enough to be present but far enough to give his wife the space she needed. The protagonist had become the bridge between them, a role he hadn't asked for but had embraced nonetheless. He spent his days shuttling between his brother's house and his sister-in-law's, helping with the kids, running errands, and offering a listening ear whenever it was needed. It wasn't easy, but he had come to see it as his way of keeping the family together. One sunny afternoon, the family gathered for a picnic in the park. It was the first time they had all been together in months, and though the atmosphere was tinged with a hint of awkwardness, there was also a sense of hope. The children ran around, laughing and playing, while the adults sat on a blanket, watching them. The brother turned to his wife, his expression earnest. "Thank you for letting me be here," he said quietly. She nodded, her eyes on the kids. They need you, she said simply. And I think I do, too. Not in the same way as before, but I want us to be a family, even if it looks different now. The brother's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't try to hide them. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. For everything. She reached over and squeezed his hand, a small but meaningful gesture. I know, she said. And I'm trying to forgive you. But it's going to take time. The protagonist watched the exchange, feeling a mix of emotions. He was proud of his brother for the progress he had made, but he also knew that the journey wasn't over. Forgiveness wasn't a destination, it was a process, one that required patience and effort. As the sun began to set, the children came running back, their faces flushed with excitement. Can we do this again next week? The youngest asked, her eyes wide with hope. The adults exchanged glances, then nodded. Of course, the brother said, ruffling her hair. We'll make it a tradition. The protagonist smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The family wasn't the same as it had been before, but maybe that was okay. They had been through something unimaginable, but they had come out the other side, stronger and more resilient. That evening, as he drove home, the protagonist reflected on everything that had happened. His brother's choices had changed everything, but they had also taught him valuable lessons about love, forgiveness, and the importance of family. He realized that life wasn't about being perfect, it was about learning from your mistakes and doing your best to make things right. When he got home, he called his brother. I'm proud of you, he said. For everything you've done to try and fix this. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a quiet, thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. The protagonist smiled. That's what family is for, he said. As he hung up the phone, he felt a sense of closure. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but he knew that they would face them together. And in the end, that was all that mattered. 2 years had passed since the storm that had torn the family apart. The wounds were no longer raw, but they were still there, faint scars that served as reminders of the pain they had endured. Yet, amidst the lingering shadows, there was light, a new kind of normalcy that had slowly taken root. The brother and his wife had found a way to coexist, not as husband and wife, but as partners in raising their children. They had decided to divorce, a decision that was painful but necessary. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension and sadness, but they had learned to put their differences aside for the sake of their kids. The children, now a little older, had adjusted to the new dynamic. They spent weekends with their dad and weekdays with their mom, and though it wasn't perfect, it worked. The brother had continued his journey of self-improvement. Therapy had become a regular part of his life, and he had joined a men's support group where he found solace in sharing his struggles and listening to others. He had also reconnected with his faith, finding comfort in the idea of redemption and second chances. His relationship with his children had grown stronger, and he made a conscious effort to be present in their lives, attending school events, coaching their soccer games, and helping with homework. The wife, too, had found her footing. She had gone back to work, rediscovering her passion for her career. She had also started dating again, though cautiously. I'm not ready for anything serious, she had told the protagonist one evening over coffee. But it's nice to feel like I'm moving forward, you know? The protagonist had watched all of this unfold with a mix of pride and relief. He had been the glue that held the family together during the darkest days, and though it had been exhausting, he wouldn't have had it any other way. He had learned a lot about himself during that time, about his capacity for patience, his ability to forgive, and the depth of his love for his family. One crisp autumn afternoon, the family gathered for a special occasion, the brother's 40th birthday. It was the first time they had all been together in a long time, and though there was a hint of awkwardness, there was also a sense of celebration. The wife had organized a small party at her house, inviting close friends and family. The children had made a banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Dad," in colorful letters, and the brother had tears in his eyes when he saw it. As the party wound down, the brother pulled the protagonist aside. "I just want to say thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I don't know where I'd be without you." The protagonist smiled, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "You'd have figured it out," he said. "But I'm glad I could help." The brother nodded, then hesitated. Do you think I'll ever be able to make up for what I did?" The protagonist thought for a moment before answering. "You can't change the past," he said. "But you've done everything you can to make things right. And that counts for something." The brother smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thanks," he said. "That means a lot." As the evening came to an end, the protagonist stood on the porch, watching as the kids played in the yard. The wife joined him, a cup of tea in her hands. "It's been a long road," she said, her voice soft. "It has," the protagonist agreed. "But look at us. We made it." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "We did. And I think we're going to be okay." The protagonist felt a surge of gratitude. The family had been through hell, but they had come out the other side. They weren't the same as they had been before, but maybe that was a good thing. They had learned to appreciate the little things, the sound of laughter, the warmth of a hug, the comfort of knowing that no matter what, they had each other. As he drove home that night, the protagonist reflected on the journey they had all been on. His brother's choices had changed everything, but they had also taught him valuable lessons about love, forgiveness, and the importance of family. He realized that life wasn't about being perfect, it was about learning from your mistakes and doing your best to make things right. When he got home, he called his brother. "I'm proud of you," he said. "For everything you've done to try and fix this." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a quiet, "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you." The protagonist smiled. "That's what family is for," he said. As he hung up the phone, he felt a sense of closure. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but he knew that they would face them together. And in the end, that was all that mattered.